Welcome back, RSP listeners. It's September, summer is dead and gone in the Northern Hemisphere, and we are the Religious Studies Project. I'm Christopher Cotter, and I'm joined, as ever, after what feels like months, because it's been months, by
David Robertson. Yeah, it's been a long, hot summer, and the autumn has come as quite a shock, including the workloads and responsibilities which are piling up.
Absolutely, and we're just back from a fantastic joint conference in Belfast between the British Association for the Study of Religions and the Irish Society for the Academic Study of Religions. There's going to be quite a few podcasts coming your way from that collaboration as we proceed through this new term or semester of the RSP. We're going to kick off immediately this time round with an interview from Dan Gorman, who's been speaking with Jennifer Graber on The Gods of Indian Country, which is a new book that she has coming out. Delighted to have Dan back. Delighted to be featuring Native American tradition to think for the first time. And we're going to pass straight over now. Take it away, Dan.
So I understand it's very hot in Texas, Dr. Graber.
It is. It's about 100 degrees here today.
Now it's making me wish for our never-ending winter. I'm calling from practically Canada.
Okay, that's right.
So today we're going to be talking about your new book, The Gods of Indian Country, Religion and the Struggle for the American West. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in studying Native American history, particularly since your previous project was looking at Quakers and prisons?
So the connection actually is prisons. And when I was doing research for my first book, which is on antebellum prisons, I came across several stories in which I read about Native people being incarcerated after they had participated in uprisings or other sorts of military conflicts with the Americans. And the more I ran into these stories, I became curious about kind of following up on them after my first book was finished. And as I began to read a little bit about some of these episodes, I found that religious reformers and missionaries were often active in forms of ministry to incarcerated Native people. And so that actually sounded a lot like some of the stories from my first book. And so actually prison was really the connection. And then I also, in my very first job at a liberal arts college, was asked to teach a course on Native American religions. My predecessor in the job had taught such a class. It was really popular. And when you're a young, untenured faculty member, you kind of say yes to a lot of things. Yeah. So I agreed to teach a semester-long class on Native American religions, which meant I needed to do a lot of research to prepare. And what I found was that the more research I did to prepare for that class, it helped me to understand a little bit more about what was going on in these episodes of Native incarceration that I was already interested in. And that's kind of how those two things came together.
I see. Well, this is jumping more to the topical elements of your book, but talking about the experience of incarcerated persons, I was seeing on the news this morning about the ICE's incarceration of migrant children at the border. And this sort of perverted school that they make the children attend where they're inculcating them with American values even while they can't leave these prison camps. And I was just curious, with this book about reservations, do you see it as having import for what we're going through right now?
I do, and there's a very kind of particular element, because I think we talk about incarceration, the connection between incarceration and education in a couple of different ways. Currently, the way that you're talking about in terms of children who are either seeking asylum or who have immigration cases being adjudicated while they're incarcerated, they have experience of educational structures kind of put in place inside forms of incarceration for migrants. But then also we talk about the connections between education and incarceration when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, when it comes to youth in cities, especially folks who are African American or Latino, who find themselves disciplined in their educational settings and moving into and being moved into forms of discipline that are actually through the kind of legal structure in the United States or through policing. And I think there's a precedent in the 19th century, and you can see it in Native history, but it's actually reversed. one thing I noticed about the 19th century and the way that these things are connected for Native people, is that it's actually a prison to school pipeline instead, insofar as some Native people who were incarcerated, and in the particular instance in my book, they're incarcerated after the 1874 Red River War. They're sent to prison, a military prison in this case, and an officer in the Army administrated this prison and put in place several forms of discipline that he thought to be very effective. He changed people's hairstyle. He changed people's clothing. He made people go to church. He made people go to class. And then after this period of incarceration was over, he found this experiment to be so successful and so compelling that he then bought a military barracks and opened the very first off-reservation boarding school, and modeled that boarding school on the prison, the military prison that he had administered in the earlier years. So it's actually a kind of reversal. It's a prison to school pipeline instead. But you can see how those structures are connected.
Absolutely. Well, one thing I've been thinking about in some of my own research, looking at Philadelphia, had the ethnic Jewish neighborhood near the docks, but not far from that was one of the major boarding schools for Native Americans. And so one thing that's always struck me is that you have these children being transported thousands of miles to a completely new urban environment. I can't imagine what the dislocation would be like.
Right. And actually, there's one thing we have evidence of, which I find very compelling and really heartbreaking. We have some examples of letters that students in off-reservation boarding schools wrote back to their families on reservations, and then letters their families sent to them in school. And these are letters in which people are trying to update one another about, who is sick and who is healthy, who has a job, who's actually living and who might have died, because such vast periods of time happen between these families being able to be in actual physical contact with each other. And so there's a kind of heartbreaking archive of materials that go back and forth between the reservation and the off-reservation schools, and kind of the loneliness that pervades those letters is really, it's very palpable.
Now, the story you're telling, as you mentioned, with Indian country as this idea, it's at the intersection of a couple of crumbling empires, France and Spain, and also the new American empire. So I am curious, these letters that were coming back, what language were they being written in?
So it's interesting. So I look particularly in this book at the Kiowa Indians, and at this point in time, they don't have a written history in their own, or they don't have a written language for speaking. For spoken Kiowa. That doesn't develop till the 20th century. So when they write letters home, some of them were written in English, and then would have been sent back to the reservation where they could be read by someone with English-speaking skills, which were just starting to kind of be more widely held across the population in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. Sometimes they also wrote them in this pictorial language that mimicked and put on paper the motions of Plains Indian Sign Language. So you could see these kind of visual records or non-alphabetic writing. And then, for other Indian nations, there were other Indian nations that already had written languages. And so they could write back in those languages, or they could write back in English. But there's a real variety of ways that people communicated with each other. And then people would also send each other drawings. And then sometimes like artifacts like moccasins or other pieces of clothing. So lots of things kind of circulated in that loop between the reservation and the off-reservation boarding school.
So with this book, you mentioned in other interviews that this is a real contribution to material culture, which is sort of, I guess, what historians have been calling archaeology lately. Mm-hmm. One theory I've thought about when reading your book was Jules Prown, who's talked about the importance of empathy in writing history, that you actually handle the objects, you gain the sensory information, you figure out how they were used. In what environments were you finding these objects? Did you have to go to the Kiowa reservation? Were these in archives across the country?
So many of these things are actually not in the hands of Kiowa people. There is a tribal museum, and there are some artifacts from the 19th century in that museum, but actually very few. So most of the things that I was looking at, things like drawings, TP covers, shields, calendars, which is this form of historical record keeping, they're in museums. So I spent a lot of time at the National Anthropological Archives, which is part of the Smithsonian institution. They have enormous holdings in what we would think of as kind of Plains Indian material culture. So it was there where I interacted with a lot of these materials. But then other museums around the country have just hundreds and hundreds of Plains Indian drawings. And you can go, and some of those places you're actually allowed to kind of handle those objects yourself. Sometimes those are really restricted. You might only be able to look at them while you're wearing gloves, or you might not. They might actually only make facsimiles available if the item really kind of, if they're very delicate. But they're all over the place except in Indian country.
So what are your views on repatriation then?
I'm a person who would love to see more repatriation of objects, and the support of Native communities, repatriating them within their own spaces and on their own terms. There are folks at the Kiowa Tribal Museum who interact with the Smithsonian and do work on kind of some cultural preservation sorts of projects. But there are a lot of materials, Kiowa materials, that are very far away from Kiowa people. So one thing I've tried to do in my own research is gather digital images of objects that are in other places, and I'm working with the Tribal Museum to make some of those accessible. And right now, digital might be one of the forms where we can do that most easily. Repatriation has been a really thorny issue ever since NAGPRA was passed in the 90s, and I think we still have a long way to go.
We're talking about this idea of repatriation. This then calls to mind the related concept of, I guess, decentering our narratives about American history. So when I think back to I'm not that old, but when I think of just a few years ago when I was in high school, there really was no Native American history being taught to us. And even though the narrative of American religion has expanded to include other faiths, Native American religions really aren't a part of that. I was curious if you've thought at all about how we should be teaching Native American religions to children.
Oh, that's great. So I think there's a couple of things, or a couple of levels on which I could respond to that question. When I teach at UT, at the University of Texas, I have lots and lots of students who also have had very little background in at least their high school years with Native American history. Many of them do a unit in their Texas history class about Native nations that had either occupied or moved through what became Texas. But it's very much a kind of pre-colonial story. And then once there are kind of Texans here, Native people disappear from that story, which is part of Texas history, actually. And so what I find is that students are really eager to learn more. And so one thing I've done in my own classes at UT is just up the number of lectures and syllabus content percentage that cover Native materials. So I begin my class on American religious history at Cahokia in the High Middle Ages, and we start with a major Native city along the Mississippi. And many of my students are really surprised that we start, in the year 1100. But that's where we start. And I actually, this past year, ended the class with the protests at Standing Rock. So I wanted to try to kind of push deeper into the Native past in North America, but also not allow Native people to disappear once we get into the 20th and 21st century. But I can also think about this question. Both my children, who are just finished 4th and 7th grade, just finished Texas history in public school, and both of them had units that interacted with Native history in Texas. And that's one where I think, Texas has a very particular and really difficult history around Native people. And I think some real honesty about Texans and their real effort to rid the state of Native in the mid 19th century. Like, we have to grapple with that when we teach this as a part of Texas history. It is Texas history, and I'd love to see a little bit more kind of grappling with that story.
Well, it's interesting you living in Texas, and I'm thinking that many of the major high school textbook companies are also based in Texas, and they're advancing a, well, shall we say, conservative reading of American history.
Yeah, that's right. And Texas, of course, is a textbook market that then shapes the national market. There are other states that are interested in that same sort of narrative crafted for Texas. That narrative is also kind of favored in other places. So what happens in Texas textbooks then happens elsewhere as well. And so actually kind of reshaping that story here has been, and thinking about that story has been an important part of a lot of historians who work in universities here in Texas. There's a kind of network of us who at times go and talk at the Texas Board of Education meetings, at their public hearings, kind of working on these questions about who is represented, how the past is represented. It's an uphill battle here.
I was thinking that in April, I was in Oklahoma City, and I went to the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. And
Yes.
You can see there that this battle is being fought in the museum, because you can tell that it was very clearly started as the Cowboy Museum, and now they're
Yes.
bringing in the Native American exhibits.
Yep. And that's a really amazing museum insofar as you're absolutely right. Like, it was for a long, long time just the Cowboy Museum, right? The National Cowboy Museum.
A story they
and
tell
they've had
well.
really kind of pushed that, the name change that adds Western heritage and then kind of tries to kind of broaden and be more inclusive about who's within that Western heritage, kind of mirrors much bigger kind of trends in public history that are really important. And that museum actually has a ton of incredible Plains Indian material culture in their archive. It's one of the places I went to do research. They have amazing holdings.
But it's not on display.
But it's not on display. You're absolutely right. So that's another place where I think they're kind of taking baby steps or the initial steps to kind of make a more inclusive story, but there's still a long way to go.
While I was at the museum, they had an exhibition of paintings by I believe he was a Creek Seminole artist named Jerome Tiger. He painted in the mid-20th century, and his paintings are distinctive because the figures it's a flat background. There's no sense of depth to the picture. Mm-hmm. And when I was reading your book and looking at the many photographs of, I guess they're digital scans of these drawings that Kiowa people made, it's very similar design, this lack of depth, this flat image.
Yes.
I was curious, have you looked at all at Kiowa art since the reservation? Well, I guess we're still in the reservation period. Rather, have you looked at paintings made in the last 100 years, the art forms that were developing in the 19th century? Do they continue?
They do. There's actually, there was a set of artists that have been called by some folks the Kiowa Five. And then eventually there was a realization that there was also a female artist there. And so she's now a part of a group now dubbed the Kiowa Six. Artists who grew up and were young children at the end of the 19th century, turn of the 20th century, and who kind of inherited many of the artistic traditions. They would have seen people drawing. They would have seen people painting on teepees. They would have seen Kiowa calendars where people did history. And they would have seen these kinds of artistic practices. They then were sent to school. And one of the places they were sent to school, there was a teacher who really tried to help them develop artistic skills without having them necessarily abandon the particular Plains Indian visual style that they had learned as young people. And so there was a kind of school of artists really popular in the 1920s and 30s called the Kiowa Five. And there are actually now in the contemporary period many Native artists who have a Plains Indian background who kind of riff on letter art, and they kind of take the kind of that flat presentation that you're talking about, and they bring that into they kind of combine that with contemporary materials. So this idea, that style that developed on the plains in the 18th and 19th century on teepees and later on paper is still being riffed on by Native artists, and it's pretty exciting.
I remember in the book, you don't talk too much about the materiality of how the drawings are made. So I was curious if you might elaborate a little bit. They're creating drawings. They're sending them back from school. Previously, they would have been making drawings on buffalo hide. Do you have any information about sort of this transition about Kiowa art from being done on sort of natural materials to on the materials that are provided by the American Empire?
Yeah, and so it's that critical moment of contact with the Americans that brings these new drawing materials into play. There's an anthropologist at the Smithsonian who has been trying to find if we have any examples of Kiowa drawing on paper really prior to the reservation period, and she has not been able to find any, even though we have ample examples of shields, teepees, buffalo hide, as you suggested. But it's really contact with the Americans, first through the establishment of the reservation, but then also for some Kiowa in the period of incarceration. The man who ran the military prison where many Kiowas were sent after the Red River War gave out paper and pencils and colored pencils as a way for people to pass the time. And then later noticed that the Native men were trading these drawings with one another. And then he encouraged them to sell drawings to tourists, which is one of the reasons that they show up in Eastern Seaboard Museum so often. So really, it's that contact with Americans that makes paper and pencil available. And in some ways, there's a sort of, paper and pencil is just easier to use than
sure.
a buffalo hide. So in some ways, like, it just becomes easier to draw and to paint with these new materials. And Native artists just really take up those new materials with gusto.
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but we just wanted to let you know, to remind you about our Patreon link. The Religious Studies Project has always been free since its inception, but we know that there's a great problem in academia with people not being paid for the work that they're expected to do, particularly early career scholars. And we at the RSP want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you can help if you can spare even £1 a month by going to patreon.com/Project RS and subscribing. We know that these podcasts are very useful for people who are teaching and people in their learning. So if you can help either by subscribing there or by making a one-off donation using the PayPal button on our website, it would be greatly appreciated and will help us keep bringing you this podcast for free and fight against exploitation in academia. But now, back to the episode.
So I'd like to transition a little bit from the theoretical material to talk about the narrative of the book in particular.
Okay.
You begin The Gods of Indian Country with this evocative description of the 1873 Sundance on the Sweetwater Reservation, which is newly created in what's modern Oklahoma. I was thinking of past books of Native American history, for instance, Anthony Wallace's The Death and Rebirth of the Seneca, or Tracy Lavelle's The Catholic Calumet. Those also start in the middle of a ritual the way you do. Were you consciously trying, is this a trope that you were working with, or was that kind of an accidental comparison?
You know, that's interesting that that both of those books also begin with a ritual. Actually, my inspiration for this was the beginning of Robert Orsi's The Madonna of 115th Street.
Oh, right, with the street processions.
With a ritual. And what I remember when I was trying to figure out how to start the book, because it's a book that technically begins in 1803, but I didn't think actually starting in 1803 was the place to start, because there really wasn't much contact between Americans and Kiowa. Like, there's no contact in that period. And so I was thinking about, how do I set up all that's at stake in this contact, that, or at least that eventually will be at stake with the contact between Kiowas and Americans. And this particular Sundance has had a lot of witness, or not witness necessarily, or in some ways kind of witness documents left over, and a lot of anthropological material, ethnographic interviews where people reflected back on it. So there was a lot of, how we say, evidence about this particular one, and to me it had a lot. It had a lot of interpretive potential, because it's one where we have the first American, or at least the one that we know for sure. There's an American witnessing the ritual, and he wrote so much about it. about his experience of it. So I started to think that it could be a really great place to start, but I also didn't want to foreground the Quaker who witnessed it. I didn't really want to foreground his experience. I wanted to try to kind of make the reader go into the Kiowa world, and not just the Quaker's world as he experienced the Kiowa. And that made me think about Bob Worsey, and how effectively in his book he brings the reader with this kind of dramatic story into the world of the Catholics who are celebrating the Festa for Mount Carmel in Harlem. And and I know people have lots of things to say about the beginning of that book, but I find that book really effective in drawing readers in and bringing them into this question about intercultural encounter. So yeah, he's really the inspiration there.
I was not expecting Italian Catholics in Manhattan, but now that you mention it, it does work.
Yeah, I mean, that's the joy of religious studies, right? Like, you can take reflections on a ritual somewhere and use those tools in a ritual in a different part of the world. So.
Yeah, comparison's tricky. For instance, when I mentioned the flat drawings without the sense of perspective that you see in European art, my mind originally went to actually the drawings you see in ancient Egyptian artifacts. And then I was thinking, well, is that a fair comparison to make since they're so far apart?
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting, art historians have really done a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to interpreting and understanding Plains Indian visual art. And I think one of the things that they have really argued is to take this art very seriously as art. Despite its having a different sense of perspective, and despite, because in the 19th century, there were many people, many Americans, when they encountered this art, they thought it was childlike and simplistic. And art and actually early anthropologists were also not interested in it because they wanted to see works on buffalo hide, not paper, right? They didn't want Native people to be changing. They wanted to preserve this kind of timeless and older idea that they thought Native people had been performing. They didn't want to kind of look at this paper stuff, which was they considered an innovation. So it's been art historians who have really tried to say, this is art, and we need to take it seriously as art in the same way that we don't even question anymore whether what ancient Egyptians were creating was art, right? It's art.
Right.
But it took a longer time for folks to be able to talk that way about Plains Indian art.
And one thing I appreciate about your book is that you're using these, you're not only using the drawings and paintings as validations of Native American art, you're also using it to show that they're recording their history as it's happening. So, for instance, you have, after the Osage Indians attack in 1833, I believe, you have these drawings showing Kiowas memorializing their dead.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes, and that is. Oh, sorry, I won't interrupt. Sorry.
No, it's all right. I just am getting excited about this. As the book goes on, you have just example after example of into the reservation period as their land's being taken away. They're interpreting their history in a completely different language from the Americans.
Right, and one of the most kind of pervasive ideas that is a part of the whole complex that we talk about in terms of the vanishing Indian, right? The way that Americans were kind of writing Native people out of the future. And one of the kind of tropes that would be kind of constantly brought up in the whole vanishing Indian rhetoric was, these are people with no history, right? They have no sense of their own history. And this would be one of the many reasons that these folks would see that, there will be an eventual disappearance of Native people. And so part of what and I think this is a bit perpetuated by historians who are kind of unwilling to deal with non-alphabetic sources, right? Like that there aren't sources outside of alphabetic and textual sources. And so what I really wanted to do was kind of push against, or at least show how hard Americans were working to banish Indians, while at the same time Native people were absolutely creating they were historicizing themselves, and they had debates about like which events do you memorialize, right? What's going to go into the calendar as the most significant event of this year, and different calendars have different events. memorialized, right? So not only are they keeping that history, they debate that history. It was important to me to really front load those sources, and then also kind of send a message to historians who often say that it's difficult to work on Native materials if you don't have a textual or a written language in any period. Like, yes, you can. You just have to be creative about it.
In designing the layout of the book, did you select the position of the images, or did your editors do that?
We kind of worked together. I usually suggested a placement, and sometimes they took the suggestion, and just went with it. And other times we kind of negotiated where things might go. I feel really lucky. From the beginning, I asked them for some color plates, like a section of color plates.
Yes.
And was completely shocked when they said yes. So unfortunately, the plates can't be kind of interspersed in the text, just because that would make production very difficult. But I'm really glad they're there. They mean you have to kind of toggle through the text a little bit when one of those plates comes up. But I'm really glad that it's present. And one of the things I found early on with the editors and the outside reviewers is that they were very open to the placement of especially Kiowa drawings and Kiowa calendar examples as ways to kind of reinforce this message that they are documenting themselves, remembering their past, and interpreting their new situations.
There's an encyclopedic component to the book, I suppose, in that you're bringing these images to a wider audience. You also supply an extensive appendix of historical figures from the Kiowa community. I forget the word Wikipedia uses. I think it's disambiguating, because you say there are all these name variations, and you put them all in one place for the first time.
Yeah, and actually, I worked with an anthropologist who's been active in Kiowa country for a very long time, and he was very generous. He has worked for a long time to collect not only kind of all the possible Kiowa name variations that are possible, because they appear in lots of different ways in different kinds of sources. So he was really vital in my effort to get names spelled correctly and represented correctly. Because there's just so many ways. There's still a long history of Native names being mangled by American authors. So I just wanted to be really as careful as I possibly could and do the best work around naming and making sure that I could give the best and most thorough account of naming that I could, because naming is one of the places where I think there's been shortcuts taken in American history, in the work of American history.
What would you say the book's thesis is?
I'd say it has two. I have a thesis about the Americans who are involved in the process of colonizing the Kiowa, and then a thesis about the Kiowa themselves. In terms of those who are the Americans operating to colonize Kiowas, I was interested in the folks who saw themselves as a kind of peaceful vanguard coming into Indian country. These were folks who decried what was happening with the military, and when there would be military attacks on Native people. They hated Andrew Jackson and the Indian Removal Bill, but they were absolutely kind of foundational and crucial to American expansion. And I think that their effort to designate expansion as potentially peaceful enterprise was very effective. And they very effectively masked other kinds of colonial violence. They weren't Andrew Jackson. They weren't Sherman. They didn't operate in those ways, but they were absolutely essential to the occupation and suppression of Kiowa people, and somehow very successfully named that a peaceful process. So that was what I wanted to study about them. Like, how did they effectively name something violent, take something violent and name it peace, and convince everybody? Because I think they did. I think they convinced other people that this was peaceful. So that's my main kind of concern with those folks. I think with Kiowa, the thesis in terms of the Kiowa response, I wanted to show that religion was one of the central ways and one of the central places that Kiowas could draw on traditions, but also create these new sorts of rituals to address changing situations. So I wanted to kind of show that there were ways of riffing on the past and bringing the past into the present, but then also this kind of incredible ritual flexibility and creativity that helped them as they tried to resist occupation.
In terms of resistance, you don't use the word prophetic to describe the sort of religious practices that are happening on the reservation. The Sundance, the ghost dance, eventually experiments with peyote, even interpretations of Christianity. What was your choice not to use the word prophetic?
There are a couple of reasons for it, partly because in the 19th century, and this happened with kind of movements around the United States, that word could be used derisively by Americans. They would talk about maybe a tribal nation that had some sort of revitalization movement in direct response to American occupation, and they would talk derisively about a prophet who was at the center of it, right? And usually meaning prophet in like scare quotes, like not a real prophet, right? But a prophet to these people with bad religion. So I wanted to get away from it because it had been used pejoratively. And then I think also there's so much great work in religious studies about varieties of movements in colonial settings where religion is kind of reimagined to address a colonial situation, that I wanted to kind of draw on language from that work. I felt that those writings, whether they be about colonial era occupations of parts of sub-Saharan Africa or in Australia, that work was really, to me, way more useful and had so much more kind of something much more, the language out of those projects was so much more kind of compelling and rich that I thought, you know what, I just don't even need this word prophet. It would have been a little easier, right? Like, I think when you say Native American prophecy, it communicates something to readers, right? They might think of Tecumseh's brother. They might think of Handsome Lake. So there's some effectiveness and usefulness to it. But I was willing to kind of give that up because I wanted to kind of see if we could do something else with some other kinds of language.
So we're just about out of time, but we're almost up to the present talking about the endurance of Kiowa religion. At the close of your book, in the epilogue, you talk about your own journey to Kiowa country in Oklahoma and witnessing these ceremonies. And you're seeing things that outsiders typically don't, and it's very fraught to be a white person to be present there. How did Kiowa people respond to you wanting to tell their story without being a full member of the community?
Well, when I went to visit, one of the things I always tried to make clear was that I was not an anthropologist, right? I wasn't doing interviews. I wasn't going to quote. I wasn't taking big observations. I wasn't trying to be a kind of classic participant observer. So in some ways, I didn't necessarily bear the burden I think that anthropologists often bear when they go to work within Native communities. I have some friends who are anthropologists in Kiowa communities, right? And they are people who have these kind of decades-long sets of relationships. So one thing I tried to make clear was that my story is using historical sources, but that anyone kind of working in Native American history today also talks about how there's a sort of responsibility to the present. And Peter Nabokov in his book talks about this, right? Like there's no Native history that doesn't have a connection to today. So I think one of the things I felt like I needed to do was just to try my best to understand the present without really asking anything. So when I would go there and I just would do things like show up at church. And if folks wanted to talk to me, great. If not, great. And that helped me. I kind of just started by showing up, but I really wanted to be clear about not kind of asking for anything. And I think I just kept showing up enough that I made some friends. And I think along with that, I've always tried to signal that my hope is that I will, if anything is desired of me, I will give it back. So, I think it's a different. I think when historians are dealing with Native communities, even though you have this kind of project that's related on documents from the past, and you don't necessarily ever have to. I could have written this book and never gone to the reservation, but I also felt that by going there, I was able to write about the past with an eye toward the present, especially because I can see those communal values that I write about in the past. Those are still operative, and I witnessed those things, and that was really kind of powerful. And I think it helped me write a better book.
We have been speaking to Jennifer Graber at the University of Texas, Austin. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much. I had fun.
Wonderful to hear from you, Dan. And Dan's been quite rightly pushing for that interview to go out as early as we could because of its particular tie-ins with the current political situation with a certain orange man in the north of America. So, thanks so much.
Why do I feel that his name's going to come up more than once in the next little run of episodes?
I don't know. Talking of topical, we've just been recording a special episode, one of many, we hope, for our Patreon subscribers. Well, I suppose we can tell you a little bit about it. We thought that we've got this sort of critical mass of critical analysis going on the RSP, but why not turn it towards contemporary news stories and contemporary developments in the RS field that should be of interest to our listeners. So we recorded a nice half hour there with Brianne Fallon all the way from Sydney, and that will be available on Patreon shortly. So watch out for that, and it's a sort of encouragement for you all to sign up there.
$1 a month gets you that new show, which we haven't got a title for yet, once every few weeks, different guests each time. It gets you some special Q&A episodes. We've just recorded one with Carol Cusack, and we've got another one in the pipeline, and some other exclusive stuff. I've got a video of a presentation Chris and I did on digital humanities, which I'm preparing to upload as well. So $1 a month gets you all of those. Plus, of course, it gets you classroom edits of these episodes, which ironically, if you're listening to one, you won't hear this because it's just the interview without our presentation and without the adverts and the rest of it, and it's designed for you to use in teaching in the classroom. Just going straight to the interview.
And on that note, we've also been delighted to receive sort of a subscription from the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Alabama, facilitated by one of our trustees, Russell McCutcheon, and so the whole department at Alabama are going to be getting access to all of this bonus content. So if you have a lot of students, if you're involved in a department, you may want to consider a departmental sponsorship. You can contact Sammy Bishop about that through the RSP site, and we'll get that content to you. On the topic of the website,
you may have noticed something of a facelift. Long overdue. We'd been talking about it for years. You probably thought we were just flapping our gums, but no, it was a big job. So we've hired somebody to do it. Given that it's such a big job and a complicated site, there are inevitably a few gremlins creeping about. If you find them, for God's sake, don't feed them after midnight or get them wet. Just drop us an email at editors@religiousstudiesproject.com, and we will put it on our list of things to fix, and we'll get it all sorted in due course.
Yeah. Big one is images. We're well aware that a lot of the old images might appear sort of stretched and out of proportion. We'll be working through that. So apologies that it's not quite perfect, but we hope that you enjoy the general aesthetic of the new face. We certainly do.
Yeah, it's not only aesthetically improved, but it should be much more functional. In terms of searchability, for instance, is much improved. So, yeah, have a play, have an explore, and anything you find, let us know.
So next week, we've got a roundtable episode for you. I had a cracking conference at the European Association for the Study of Religions back at the end of June in Bern in Switzerland. I recorded 4 interviews there. Sammy Bishop recorded 2, Tom White recorded 2, and we also got this roundtable and a load of video content recorded as well. So we thought, because the roundtable is on the topic of academic conferences in general, what are they for, who are they for, what do they achieve, and we reflect a lot on the conference itself, and we're present in Moritz Klenk's amazing podcasting studio, and we thought that would be a good way to sort of set the scene for the 8 interviews that are going to be following from the conference over the next few months.
Yeah, and, an enormous thanks is due to the EASR for their support of the RSP, which allowed us to have such a presence there and record so many interviews. That is something that's going to be ongoing. We will have an RSP official correspondent, I suppose is the word, at the EASR next year and the year after that, hopefully, and hopefully in perpetuity. So thanks to the EASR for making that happen.
And I think we've whittled on quite enough there. There's, a thing I've been dying to say for months. I've been saying it in the shower, in my sleep, to anyone who's been speaking to me or being forced to be in my presence on public transport.
Is it, leave me alone! Leave me alone!
Thanks for listening.
The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Jonathan Tuckett, and our opportunities digest by Jana Shirley. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio assistance from Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, and sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop.
Don't forget, you can support the project using our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links, or by donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes, and other portals.